So my understanding of racism in the Malaysian conversation is that it's still largely rooted in colonialism. So the reason why, well, at least to my understanding, this construct of racism came about because of the divide and rule policy by the British, and this, to some extent, this wariness that's between especially the three major races, it's also because of how the British treated the Chinese and Indian immigrants, for example, back then. So they treated them as basically immigrants who provided them work labor, and this also came about, I think, in how the jus soli status was granted to the Chinese and the Indian immigrants. So this sort of second-class citizen treatment somehow percolated through to our racial relations today. So that's why, to a great extent, I think that racism is rooted in colonialism. In order to shift that narrative away, we would actually have to disentangle from this association, which is very difficult to do, by the way. For nationalism, on the other hand, I think that it's a continuous attempt by our country to understand, how do I say, like, because we're still also rooted in this colonialism, these ties with colonialism, but then on the other hand, we're also trying to rebrand ourselves and trying to reconcile or understand our identities. In terms of being able to carve out this inclusive national identity, in order to do that, I think one thing needs to be done first, which is to first create a Malaysia that truly includes everyone. To do this, I think two things need to be done. Firstly, to practice the fact that everyone, Malays, Chinese, Indians, Orang Aslis, Orang Asals, all indigenous communities in Sabah and Sarawak, so all these communities, we should practice the fact that everyone are citizens of Malaysia, and that all of them have equal rights and dignity as citizens. The second point is to look beyond ethnicities and to solve the issues that occur in each community. The reason why politicians still advocate for ethnic-based politics is also because, to some extent, I think, of these stereotypes and beliefs that are still prevalent in the majority of the non-urban population in Malaysia, for instance. So in order for politicians, for example, to stop this ethnic-based politicking, the public would also need to realize that they need to stop perpetuating ethnic generalities or stereotypes. Of course, as I said again, the governments also need to implement needs-based socioeconomic policies. By doing that, then we can ensure that everyone, regardless of ethnicity, even in the case of religion, would be able to have all their rights fulfilled. So these two aspects need to be implemented in order to ensure that we have a truly inclusive Malaysia. What I think the vision of Malaysia would be for everyone after the next 10 years would be a high-income nation that has three characteristics. The first one is to have an economy that is not only competitive and dynamic, but also ensures equitable wealth distribution among all Malaysians. That's the first point. The second one is that this country should have a society in which everyone enjoys equal access to resources and fulfillment of all human rights across all areas of life. By that I mean social, economic, political, civil and cultural, without any discrimination or violence. So that's the second one. Third one is to be led by democratic institutions and leadership that are accountable and transparent. We still face many inequities in fulfillment of our rights. So for example, one very blatant example I think I will touch on later as well would be political representation. So various women's rights groups, including Awam, have been advocating for the 30% critical mass in political representation, because without enough women voices in parliament, we can't push policies that are responsive to women's rights and issues. So right now, for example, our current Dewan Rakyat representation of women MPs, right, is only 14.9%. So there's a long way to go for political representation. Of course, women also face quite a bit of discrimination from the standpoint of legislation. So for example, under Article 8.2 of the Federal Constitution, there is the clause of non-discrimination on the basis of gender. However, there is a catch whereby this provision only applies to perpetrators in the public sector. So let's say if the actor or perpetrator is from the private sector, so for example, like from a corporate, then this Article 8.2 will not apply. Of course, on the other hand, there's also this whole other chunk of stereotypes that women still endure in many areas of life, be it in employment, for example. Women are not able to freely choose, for example, like work arrangements, time, the profession that they may want to take up, because, for example, women still bear the disproportionate amount of care work, non-paid care work at home. When I say that, I mean in childcare, also in house chores. So when women have to do the brunt of the housework, technically they can't really have free choice in terms of, like work arrangements and everything. The other huge area in which women still largely experience discrimination or stigma is actually in the area of reproductive choice. In terms of persons with disabilities, so women with disabilities and girls, basically, they are actually among the most marginalised groups when it comes to all areas of life, be it access to even basic infrastructure that would support them in buildings, in workplaces, etc. Even in education, in access to work, employment, and even in the case of gender-based violence. So women and girls with disabilities actually, if I'm not mistaken, they're up to 10 times more likely or 8 times more likely when it comes to being victims of gender-based violence. And they're at a greater position of being abused because their perpetrators are most likely caregivers. 2 things need to be done. The first one is to ensure that our political system is one that allows for such voices to be present now. So right now, our political system is not exactly the most inclusive one, being that it's very male dominated, for instance. So take the case of women, right? As I've mentioned earlier, the representation of women in the Dewan Rakyat is only 14.9%, which is very far from 30%. So in this particular case in politics, by right, quotas should be implemented so that, women's representation, at least be it at the state legislative level or at the Dewan Rakyat level, can be hastened. Other examples that can be considered in order to increase women's representation is public funding, for instance, to the political parties to have women-held seats. And another example would be addressing the culture within political parties as well, because there are certain features within political parties that do impede women from participating on a parity basis as men. One with that example being, for example, patronage by senior party members. So when women historically already have fewer resources to begin with, and if support systems are not being awarded to women on the same basis as men, with that patronage thing in place, it's gonna make women candidates a lot more difficult to put forward themselves as candidates when it comes to elections. Other examples include also having party leadership that actually prioritize this agenda, be it having more women leaders as senior party members, or at least it's equally important to have male allies as well to champion the gender equality agenda. Applying what I've said earlier for women, we can actually apply these to other marginalised communities like the Orang Aslis and the indigenous communities in East Malaysia, especially the case for Orang Aslis, because Orang Asli, for example, we don't really have Orang Asli women as MPs before. So having these measures would be very helpful. That's the first point. The second point is to make sure that the political environment is a safe one. The reason why I say this is because of what we've seen over 2 or 3 decades. For example, the sexist, ableist, ageist and racist remarks that we've seen made by MPs against other MPs from minority groups or marginalised communities in Parliament. So when democratic institutions and governments are allowed to do something like this, it essentially legitimizes violence by other stakeholders, including the private sector and also the public. And when this is done on a systemic basis, it basically gives off this entire impression that it's not safe to be in politics for people from marginalised communities, and that they're being punished because of their ethnicity, because of their gender, because of their sexual orientation, and etc. and etc. It's not just important to develop policies, but it's even more important, in my opinion, to implement these policies, because it has been shown time and time again that Malaysia is very good in coming up with blueprints and guidelines and policies, but we are subpar when it comes to implementation. Yeah, so it's very important to enforce these policies, because without ensuring the safety and that these political candidates are not discriminated against, if we don't ensure these, we cannot guarantee the fulfillment to other rights, and those rights will include the right to political participation and public office. On one hand, migrants are very important to us, and we see this also in how much our industries rely on these migrant workers. And there are 5 sectors that primarily rely on migrant workers. So we have agriculture, we have plantation, we have construction, we have manufacturing, we have the services sectors. So these 5. On the other hand, due to many factors such as poor governance, corruption, and etc., employers have been, not all of them, but there have been violations of migrant workers' rights by employers. And we see this in the unfair wages being paid to them, subjecting them to very long work hours, little to no social protection benefits, poor labour and working conditions, and unfair termination. So when unfair termination happens, that's when they become undocumented, and that's when also other ramifications arise, such as vulnerability to being detained or persecuted by the governments when they do their immigration raids, because Malaysia is also, as all of us would be well aware generally, that Malaysia is not exactly the most friendly nations when it comes to immigrants and refugees and asylum seekers altogether. Oh sorry, not immigrants, but refugees, asylum seekers and migrants. With regards to the government, I also generally understand it to be shifting between, so it's more like a thermostat, or if it's not a thermostat, it's more like responding in response to demands locally. So let's say, for example, like there's a labour shortage, right? Then the government will suddenly implement this policy and to suddenly bring in this influx of migrants. And then when labour shortage is sort of alleviated, or when this problem is not so much of a problem anymore, that's when the policies do cut back. In short we have not been implementing policies that optimize migrants, neither do we treat them properly. But then unfortunately, for Malaysia to survive, we also have to adapt to current industry demands, so with it being Industry 4.0. So in most cases where migrants are concerned, right, they're actually involved in the low-skilled jobs. So as much as we need migrant workers currently, for the future of the country, we actually have to reduce over-reliance on migrant workers. And by that may probably mean more strictly monitoring, for example, like employers when it comes to their processes, and also ensuring that they're providing optimal working conditions for employees, regardless of whether it's migrant or whether it's a local. Because labour rights, no matter what, it applies across the board to everyone. One narrative that I think should be propagated a lot more often and a lot more wider or broader is that if we do not treat our migrants well enough, it actually will end up hurting our own people. Because at this stage currently, as I've mentioned earlier, our key industries are actually depending on these migrants for productivity. So if you don't provide the migrants with those migrants, which we should be taking care of them, but if you're not providing them what they are due, which would be the labour rights, then how can they productively contribute to the industries, and how can the industries then contribute to the economy? Another thing that I think I need to emphasize is that there is a gap in our legislation for employment, which is that domestic workers are not included as employees. So when it comes to the whole whole range of labor rights from minimum wage, maternity benefits, even work hours, rest days, everything. They are not covered. So we have to, and unfortunately, most Malaysians may not resonate as much with the issue because a lot of the domestic workers are foreigners. But I've personally, I think last weekend, the Women's Tribunal, so the Women's Tribunal actually featured 1 or 2 testimonies of domestic workers who are Malaysians. So we can actually see how this legislation can even impact our own people. So it's important to actually propagate the narrative that we need to take care of everyone in order to be able to, achieve more higher goals, like having a more productive economy, or having a more competitive or dynamic entrepreneurial or industrial environment, or even attaining high income status. Because if we want to expect to be able to achieve high income status by, 10 years later, 2030, we would need to be able to ensure that everyone is economically prosperous, or at least have an equitable share when it comes to wealth.